Okay, it's Thursday morning, September 4th, and we're standing at the dock at Put-in-Bay watching the arrival of the Niagara.
I never drunk it.
There's some sturdy and stout lads ready for the sail.
Yeah.
And Rosemary.
Captain, we glad to be able to get you on board today. I think it's going to be a bit stiff and a little bit lumpy for starters, but it's going to smooth out as the day goes on. Because we have this north wind, the first thing we're going to do is actually be motoring for a little while to get ourselves a ways to windward, so we we'll actually head out towards the battleground, so that'll give us some room to play with.
Yeah, it's lower than I remember. It's much lower than I remember.
Same height it's always been, sir.
Hey, we're below decks now, and it'd be great for short people down here, but not for me. So we're just getting underway here, leaving the Jet Express dock at Put-in-Bay, and we're going to travel out in the lake a ways under power, and then proceed under sail at that time. That's Captain Ripka.
Idle hands to the stern falls!
Here comes our prey, the Jet Express. Man the starboard guns. Okay, Steve, what are we seeing out the gun port here?
The Jet Express 2.
Oh.
We're heading out to battle here.
Racing.
By God, we missed it the first time. Man the port guns. The Jet Express running scared. She'll live to fight again another day.
So you're a friend of
It's been 50 years since I heard it. Just being through.
He's in the head right now.
Wish.
captain, stay slow. Loose jib, loose main captain, stay slow. Loose main, stay slow.
You guys ready on the sheet?
My hand hurts just watching. That's easy.
Couple good sweats on that halyard
Sweat
now.
those braids. Now we're gonna sweat it.
Jerry, which sail is this?
Which?
The one you just
One more. Make it fast.
Make it fast.
Five, center, outboard, then near and left. Right.
Fired. Pat, do you want us braced? What do you want us braced? 2 points. So we're at 2 points right now, right? Hey, give me a...
This is the spanker?
This is the spanker.
Well, make it fast.
You do have. See, this is.
There's one of those lines on both sides of the sail, out the back and out the front. And so you tie them together to each other around the bundled up sail. The spanker still has one reef tied in, loose foot. But so we had, the order was shake out the reefs. Not blowing hard, don't need them anymore, but all of the lines had to get undone. And that's why it took about twice as long to loose the sail. Most of the time, if you don't have reefs to shake out, you'll only send maybe 2 ships. Just go directly into the direction the wind is coming from. Now, so I'm not talking too simplistically. How many sailors do we have?
Instruments gallant
How
gear!
many people are not sailors? Okay, fair enough. So I see one of the things to keep in mind about a ship, a sailing ship, is you can't go directly in the direction where the wind is coming from. You have to be a certain number of degrees off so that the wind can get behind the sail. And I point the sail right into the wind, it's going to be flapping like a flag. Wind's going down both sides of it. It's not doing anything to push you along. If you, with a square sail like this, if you get the wind on the forward side, the ship will literally go backwards. So you have to get, you can angle the yard, you can brace them. Now if the yards are set square to the center line of the ship like this, it said you've squared the yards. And this is the way you see ships in model cases. This is the way you see them at the dock being displayed. This is the way they trim themselves up in port. This is the way they almost never look at sea.
Aloft on the main gallant! Let fall!
Because the only time this would do you any good
Sheet hung, remain
is if the wind was directly from behind. And even then, it's not your best point of sail because the wind's going to fill the mainsails and it's not going to get to the ones on the foremast. You won't be able to use the spanker because the wind's going to be trying to go down either side of it, and if it catches one side, it'll just want to skid your stern around. So you don't get to use all of your sail area effectively. So the ship does her best when you brace the yards around some number of degrees, when you can trim fore and aft sails and get the wind on the side, on the beam, or on the quarter, so everything's getting filled. Then you get maximum, everything's working for you, maximum effort. Now your limits, what's drawn on here is how far we could brace the yards before they fetched up on the standing rigging supporting the mast. And in this case, they'll come around further. We're not braced up as sharp as we can be. We can swing them around another 15 degrees or so. And if we wanted to, we could sail a little bit closer to the direction the wind is coming from. But on a ship like this, that limit is in terms of how many degrees close to ahead, how many degrees from dead ahead the wind has to be able to be filling the sail without the sail spilling, without the sail luffing, is you need to be about 67, 68 degrees off the wind. But as you sail along, as the ship's going ahead, it's also sliding sideways a little bit. So the course over the ground isn't the same as what you're pointing to. That's called the leeway. And that's usually,
Danny, ease a little on your
4 or 5 degrees or more.
Main gallon brace is ready.
I'll pause until I get that set.
That's well.
That's well, the 40-gallon halyard.
Take that higher to the pin.
Easiest to see, actually. If the, let's say the wind is coming down right parallel to these cross planks, and you're trying to sail in the direction, you're trying to get the ship to windward, you're going to end up with how high you can point plus leeway. You're going to end up about 75 degrees away from the direction of the wind. So it's about a 75-degree arc. And if you had to go the other way, 75 the other way. So there's about a 150-degree arc of the compass you don't get to use at any one time. So for a modern sloop, that's about a 90-degree arc. But for ships of this type of rig, there's quite a bit more distance that you don't get to use.
This way.
Jill.
We can eat.
Well, boys, how's the food?
Excellent, hearty meal at sea.
Where'd Cindy go? She go up on deck?
Yeah, she went upstairs. very nutritious. And for months at sea, first vegetables we've had in 6 months. I don't have any teeth left, but this is very good.
Didn't your captain ever tell you to chew with your, don't talk with your mouth full?
I do it all the time.
So how's this table enjoying the Shea Niagara?
Hi,
Fine?
very glad. You should have some better food.
Are you telling what it is, what we're having to eat?
That is some of the worst rum I've ever had, though, in that tall
Yes.
bottle.
The rum ration is terrible.
It is.
Randy will have to go to my van if we want the rum ration, sir.
What's that?
A heavy wee bit.
Boy, has been bitten. Might be from the dye in his hair.
What the four birds to the king.
Wait.
Easy to balance.
Okay.
I'm in the When did we pin these guys in?
Watch your lead, Keith. Don't like your lead, Keith.
Hold. You tell. Got it. Hold. All right. He's sweating. Now you're in a worse place. I gotta be this side.
Check the dorsal gear.
Stop.
Even speed today.
That's right. This will be a very good way to go back tomorrow and still not teach when I explain them what I do.
That's right. I could burn up the whole period tomorrow just by showing this video. Hi, class.
One of the little nuances that you learn and experience will talk for a while. Between bullshit and one of them, enemy fire. I think I'm still I feel very natural in this tech. I don't know why. It must be something genetic or something.
I'm a sailor in a previous life.
All hands, smoke wet. And heat. And heat.
Normally, the running in of the gun isn't necessary because it recoils under the weight of the gun.
We got a back match today. They are really fast. Sound fast. Captain. Captain, we're ready to load and live fire. Comes the boat.
Give you something to aim for.
Load and hold your fire.
Load and hold your fire. Tend the vent. Handle the charge. Charge the gun. Grab the charge. That's well. I like to slide that in. Put your thoughts right up in there. You can pop it once you get it installed. We're installing a wad now. Swell. Shot the gun. Put your ram in there. Yeah, that's it. Okay, now your next wad. Now you want to slide that back. Push your palm against the other wad. Run out the gun. Ready? And heat. And heat. And heat. That's well. These tables will bleed out, right? Yep. Brick and prime. Brick and prime.
Close on his hand. At top. See what I mean?
When we fire, it should be pretty loud, so you're going to want to cover your ears. We'll give you the signal.
Put out the match, cover the vent. We're going to have to stand down from this and we'll track.
Cover the vent.
I'm going to
That's
need
covered.
a couple of faces. Because
Fire!
Fire!
Fire! Wow! Get up, mother, whistling through the air. I take it you understand that was a first. Excellent. Awesome. First live shot. It is a little snug.
How are we going to get it back?
Or as they say, the first war shot.
We thought the most appropriate place to do this would be right here.
Here.
Yes. We actually ended up heading in the direction right over the ground, although in the opposite direction. It took us a little while to make sure we had the place all to ourselves.
She had no problem running in. Okay, yes.
Now imagine the level of sound with that happening once every 6 or 7 seconds, 10 times on a side every minute.
Yeah.
Several ships doing this within a quarter mile of each other.
The diver's going to find that thing he's got. Okay.
Pretty wide, Jamal. Or Jose, okay?
How many we got? 4, Mike. You're gonna have more than one trip.
Ah.
More than one trip. Yeah. That's it for now. Okay, someone on the bow painter?
Here.
Need a tape. What do you need? The tape? She's getting the tape. Get the bow painter! No, cast it off on your side, Bert. Let it go.
There go the lucky ones out to take some pictures. goes Perry's battle flag, don't give up the ship.
Oh, yeah.
That's John.
It's a high stress job.
That's good.
You let me know when to make the turn.
Okay, let me do that.
You want me to start turning? Okay. You want me to stay out in front of it?
Keep going that way, and I'll tell you that. Come back in.
Anyone on the weather side or lower?
No, this side, sun side. Whatever side you had, I'll pick the sun side.
Sunshine. So if any of you guys want to stay in for another round. Yes, roger that. We're all set.
Hold the man yard. Hold the top of the yard. Hold the gallant yard. Make them all fast. More on the main yard? Okay, more on the main yard.
These conditions, considering the light areas. Yeah. Still got a good gap on scales right now. Oh yeah,
Just come forward so that they don't talk towards you.
that's really good. Where to?
Yeah, you do it. What is? Can you lift your hat up?
Take it off.
That would be better.
Are you gonna make him take his hat? No, you don't want that bald head exposed. That's a fixture. You don't want that bald head exposed. Okay.
I
lost his George Baker.
Drawing very low sail is probably what it was.
Ready on the main station sheet? Ready on the halyard?
Breeze blowing it so that you can at least see part of the letter and you know what it says. So they do this type of thing, and that's the thing with the work that Dean does. Is it might make a better picture if you did this in some ways, but his are so accurate. And so, I mean, there's reasons that the artists do it. The artist wants to be able to show this. So,
like the Palpatine. You see Palpatine, eight crewmen in the boat instead of 4. Wearing Civil War uniforms. Carries in full dress uniform.
Make it fast. Frank, you want to give me a split?
Yes, I
Well, the sails are all being furled and we'll soon be under power again.
Little leech, too.
These guys right here are about 65 feet off the ground, and I suppose that's close to another 20 up there. Up there quite a ways.
no, they couldn't come up with an airplane. I wanted to.
They're not really screened.
Well, the romance is over and the sails are all furled.
Vineyard lifts and truss tackles fast!
And we're under power and heading back to dock.
Need 2 hands here on these. Make fast, make fast.
Make fast.
Hold.
Hold.
Ease back, of course. Ease back.
Ease.
You look better with these ones.
He is great. Fire. That's the east right now. Had them, good thing I didn't go. I guess we had shrimp, something or other appetizer, crab something, and something else.
Yeah, sure.
Well, here's one of those cases where you need a vertical shot. Oh wait, I forgot. You can't do that with a video, can you? No, not too well.
A couple more minutes before we just finish up with the handrails and can send you ashore, and then we're going to be working for a while to get the ship washed down, secure and all. We are looking at doing another short sail tomorrow morning, but tomorrow we have to get back in by noon because we have Coast Guard inspection for a traction vessel in the afternoon. And but at any rate, this was a really good day, and I'm glad it worked out. You know, when the weather forecast came in for that strong norther, I wasn't even sure we'd get here till Friday morning or Friday afternoon. But yeah, I'm very glad it worked out that we could get here and that you had the opportunity to come see the ship function on a day that really was remarkably similar weather-wise to you know, the atmosphere, the type of day of the battle. I'm sure that day was hotter, and, but in terms of light air, in terms of the way we're moving this time of day, I think this might give you some sense of it. Every time we sail this ship, we look at it as an opportunity to learn something, some little refinement of technique, some little thing about timing, some little thing about doing a maneuver a little differently than we've done it before. I'm always looking to do something that says, well, you know, what do you learn different this time? And that's the wonderful opportunity this ship presents, is that we can use her. And that's really the value. The whole value of this ship as a new creation is what it allows us to do in terms of the whole process, so that we can rediscover some of that, so that we can test certain hypotheses. That's really the dose of tradition this ship can offer. So you've had a good little view of it today. So we're looking forward to being here again this weekend. Some of you I'm seeing for the first time, and a lot of you are old friends who we've been visiting here several times. And this is you know, always good to come back here. So we're glad you had a chance to be aboard. And as soon as the bow's ready, here's the handrail. And of course, if you want to stay on board, you're quite welcome to, but there's going to be hustling and bustling and scrubbing decks and whatnot around.
Really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I got one more here.
One last shot of the brig.
Sails come off of that.
Had a fantastic sail.
Quiet. Go in. Go in. Quiet. Comfortable, don't bother me.
Little lake up.
There she goes! I have to get these guys again. The never-ending parade. Getting ready to fire the grenade for the first time. Stand ready. Get them when they start their ceremony later.
We ask that you look with compassion on
Always. What happened, Mom? I just appeared. Daddy did a good job, didn't he?
Wait.
Okay, Jim is running a worm down the barrel of the cannon, looking for any debris that could be in the barrel.
Ben, sponge. Sponge, Ben.
Okay, the sponge rammer is now ramming a water-soaked sheepskin head down the bore of the cannon to make sure there aren't any extraneous sparks which could ignite the charge as it's inserted. Okay. This is the powder monkey. He's bringing the charge up to the gun crew.
Charge, peace.
Okay, the cartridge is inserted in the muzzle, and then it'll be rammed home with the rammer.
Now you put the hard part of the rammer down.
Now, if they were firing a live shot, it would have been followed by a cannonball and rammed again, but in this case, they're just firing powder.
Frickin' front.
Okay. This man is inserting a long, pointy piece of wire in the vent hole to puncture the cartridge bag, and then he will put some priming powder in the touch hole with a quill.
Left to right. One, fire. Two. Fire. Three. Fire. Secure the piece.
Oh, that was cool.
Yay!
2,000 pounds of dead weight and a cannon. Another successful round.
Victories in the War of 1812, and it was the first real decisive victory in that war. What we're doing right now is demonstrating artillery pieces that were used in the War of 1812. The far gun down there, the small gun, is a howitzer. It's very light, a very small gun. The howitzer was used in the War of 1812 to fire an exploding shell. It was one of the few cannons that could fire an exploding shell. And it was used primarily, or it was used exclusively, as an anti-personnel weapon.
Are we playing a game here, Anna? Oh, no. Hey, you cheated me out a card. Is this a wild card?
That's a knife.
Oh, it's a spade? Okay, okay. That's fine.
Anna.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. But maybe, no, I want to put down that one instead. I don't know, because it's $50. Trying to be independent.
What are you doing?
Action! Search, peace!
See, he's going to put it down to make sure there's nothing in it. Because you don't want to put two charges down, because that would be a big mistake.
That's sponge! Sponge, convert!
Cover your ears, Anna.
No, they haven't put the charge in yet, Johnny.
Okay, charge in. And my
Handle, cartridge!
cartridge. What's that? He has the cartridge. He has the cartridge. Oh. I.
Charge, peace!
Then there's a ball.
Your daddy put in the gunpowder.
Ram, down!
Wadding put in. Now what he's doing is wadding that
He's got the dangerous job. Now he'll have to clean his.
Now they're beginning to try.
What's he doing?
Putting a little hole in the cartridge that they just put down there. And they're going to put a little wick in there.
Down into it. To break that
So when they light the wick, then it's going to go down and make the gunpowder go boom. That's what makes all the noise.
Fire!
Oh, God.
That was quite a charge. You see that?
Smell that gunpowder? You smell it?
Like macaroni and cheese.
Macaroni and cheese?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know if I'll be able to get macaroni and cheese again. Just talking to the guys now. They're not going to do any more.
Are they gonna fire it again?
No, I think that's all for today, honey. But now your mommy needs to go take a still picture.
There he goes! Riding the gun into the sunset. Okay. Okay, shoot.
Start out welcome folks all here today to Prairie's Victory and International Peace Memorial. This weekend we're celebrating the anniversary of the Battle of Lake Erie, commemorating the Battle of Lake Erie. We've been out here all weekend long, camped out over there in what's left of the camp. We're picking up and going home. This is actually the last demonstration, the last day of the commemoration. So we feel a little bit like Hendrix at Woodstock out here. So we're really glad that you stayed around, though. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the War of 1812, just to give you a little bit of background information. The War of 1812 surprisingly started in June of 1812. And if you're not really familiar with the war, don't feel bad, because it's a pretty forgotten era in American history. A lot of people think that Vietnam was the first war America was involved in that wasn't popular, and that's not true. The War of 1812 was very unpopular. There are three main reasons that the war started. One was the free trade on the high seas. If you can think back into history, a little bit about what was going on in the world, there was a big war going on in Europe. A man named Napoleon Bonaparte had conquered a fair share of Europe by 1812 and held that under his sway. The one country that he hadn't taken yet was Great Britain, and they ruled supreme on the high seas. Where Napoleon was in charge and pretty much had control of the continent of Europe, Britain controlled the sea. And so this life and death struggle was going on. You have to remember that Britain honestly felt they were fighting the devil incarnate when they were fighting Napoleon Bonaparte. The United States felt that as a free and independent nation, we should be able to trade with whomever we wanted to. And so this trade problem, Britain put up orders in council, it was called, limited what we could trade and who we could trade with. and ships would actually be seized on the high seas and taken if they felt that the cargo was contraband. So you can imagine how that went down with the American psyche at that point, having our ships taken. It was a very unpopular move. The second reason was an enhanced recruiting policy that the British Navy had that's called impressment. Now, impressment literally means to take from somebody, to take the American sailors from American ships. And the British would do that. They'd stop American ships on the high seas and they would look for British deserters. It was probably common that if you were going to desert from the British Navy, you would desert to the American side because we had a lot laxer discipline. You might go onto an American merchant ship where you didn't have anywhere near the rigid discipline on board a British ship. That probably did happen. But what happened was if a British ship of war needed 47 able-bodied seamen or 10 able-bodied seamen, they'd find 10 able-bodied seamen who were deserters on board that American ship. And I'm not talking about just 15 or 20 people here that this happened to. From the end of the American Revolution to the beginning of the War of 1812, literally thousands of American sailors were impressed into the British Navy. So you can imagine how that went down with the American psyche at that time. Remember, we're a brand new independent nation. We're very proud of our newfound freedoms in Great Britain just 30 years earlier. The third reason for the War of 1812 took place in the area that we are right now, and that is the old northwest of the American frontier. Ohio became a state in 1803. That's as far west as the United States went. As a matter of fact, the part of Ohio north of the Greenville Treaty Line, which is roughly Columbus, cutting the state in half, was still Indian territory. That wasn't even part of the state of Ohio. So you were in the wilderness at this point. And with the what was happening out here, with the Indian nations held control of the northern half of Ohio, and as encroachment from Anglo settlers came in and in and in, further and further and further, the Indians began to resist and defend their homeland. What we felt at that point was that the British were supplying the Indians with guns, with ammunition, and even with leadership to fight these white settlers. Whether that's true or not doesn't really matter. That's what we believed at that point. So President Madison, who was the President of the United States at that point, was faced with these three challenges. And he realized once these three things were brought up in Congress by a group called the Federalists that also had the term war hawks, he realized that at that point the potential for a geopolitical and military interaction with Great Britain had now undergone a dramatic upswing. He was still reluctant to declare war. Surrounded in a Congress as such as he was with myopic yes men and Federalist war hawk thugs, he did declare war finally in June of 1812. He was reluctant to do this. Why was he reluctant? Great Britain had the largest army, one of the largest standing armies in the world at that point, and they had the largest sailing navy. We had 9 ships of war go onto the high seas. The British Navy was incredibly used. They were well trained. They were well disciplined. They were one of the finest navies in the world. Why did we think at that point that we could take it? We weren't going to invade England. That was simply out of the question. Our whole idea in the War of 1812 was to capture our northern neighbor, Canada, which was a province of Great Britain at that point. What we wanted to do was take and capture Canada, hold that as a bargaining chip, and make our points known to Great Britain and get our problems addressed and have everything squared away. And we really believed that we could take Canada by just a matter of marching. A lot of the war hawks in Congress felt that by Christmas time of 1812, just marching up there, Canada would crumble and fold, and that would end the whole war to be all over by Christmas. That did not prove to be the case. In the very beginning of the war, one of the first things that happened is the city of Detroit, the man commanding the Army of the Northwest in the city of Detroit surrendered virtually without firing a shot by he was opposed by a British force and their Indian allies. He was terrified of Indians. He was an older gentleman, past his time of fighting, and he gave up the city of Detroit virtually without firing a shot. It's the only time that an American city has ever been captured and held against America by a foreign power. And with the fall of Detroit gave the British control of Michigan, the northern part of Ohio, and all of this body that surrounds us right now, Lake Erie. Why would Lake Erie be very important? I said Ohio, the northern half of Ohio, present-day Ohio, wasn't even a state. It was a wilderness. It was an indigenous hardwood forest. It was a swamp. It was impassable. The roads there were non-existent. They were trails at best. To move men and material that you needed to fight a war through there took days and days and days. It might take you 3 weeks to get from Toledo to the area of Toledo to the area of Cleveland. The city of Cleveland had fewer than 100 people living in it when the War of 1812 broke out. Gives you some kind of an idea of the wilderness that was up here. The easiest way to move material and to move supplies in a military fashion was to put boats on this lake, and you can zip them anywhere you want to be. If you control the rivers, if you control the lake, you can move men back and forth by boats, and you don't have to worry about the road. After we lost Detroit in the northern Michigan territories, once again, the deciduous inhabitants of the United States, the American Indian, sided with the Great Britain and the English and the Canadians to try to drive the Americans out of this area. We realized that we needed control of the lake. And so early in 1814, we began to build a fleet near Erie, Pennsylvania and Presque Isle Bay that would become Erie, Pennsylvania. This fleet was put under the man put in charge of the fleet was a young master commandant in the United States Navy, Oliver Hazard Perry. He was 26 years old when he came out here to build the fleet. There's been a lot said about Perry one way or another. The Battle of Lake Erie was an amazing thing. But to me, being an amateur historian, one of the most incredible things that Perry ever did was actually build a fleet of ships in the wilderness and make them sail and get them out here to Pussy Harbor. In September of 1813, those ships were right out there in the harbor in front of him. This is what he used as his base of operations. It's one of the best natural harbors on the Great Lakes, or in Lake Erie rather. And also the one vantage point is directly across the lake is the mouth of the Detroit River. A few miles up the Detroit River is where the British fleet, commanded by William Barclay, lay in wait to come out and fight someday. Now the British fleet needed to come out because once Perry came onto the Great Lakes, once he got control of Lake Erie, once he got out here, the British supply line was cut. Now they were in the same situation we were in earlier in the war. Their supplies were used up. Their 6,000 Indian allies were eating up their supplies faster than they had figured on. And then September the 9th of 1813, they were virtually out of food, and the British fleet got ready to sail. On September the 10th of 1813, the fleet was sighted right off of Rattlesnake Island, and Perry made sail to go out and fight. The luck for Perry in the beginning part of the battle was definitely against him. It took him most of the day to get out of the harbor here. If you look across over there to the Brig Niagara, it's a square sailing vessel mostly, and he did not have the advantage of the wind. It took him a long time to be able to maneuver himself out onto the Great Lake, out onto the lake where he could meet his enemy, and the weather gauge was definitely with the British. That was important for two reasons. One is the maneuverability of that sailing vessel, and two was the type of cannon that the two fleets were armed out with. The British were primarily armed with a long gun. That's a gun that had a long range. It was a big piece of metal. It was a big tube. It had a long range. Was a fairly accurate weapon. It could fire a mile. Perry's guns were smaller, shorter. A new invention in the war. By the time the War of 1812 rolled around, a fairly new thing. They're called a carronade, and we were firing one out here earlier today. That the park has. If you get a chance to come back at some point later on or next summer or whatever, the park will be firing out. We're very proud of their new carronade. It's something that you should really see. But at any rate, these weapons were designed to fire a heavy ball with a low muzzle velocity, and that gave you two advantages. One, the gun was lighter. It didn't take as much powder. It didn't take as much men to fire. The second advantage is that low muzzle velocity. The ball actually was moving slower through the air. When it hit the side of a wooden vessel, it had a smashing effect. Cannon in those days did not fire exploding shell. You needed a howitzer or a mortar to do that. But that round shot hitting the side of that wooden ship at a slow speed smashed rather than cut a clean hole, and you threw splinters through a crowded deck. And virtually you had not only the damage to the ship, but you had an anti-personnel round built in as well. Well, eventually Perry made it out onto the lake. And as he closed with the British, his main brig, the Lawrence, which is the sister ship of the Niagara out there, got ahead of everybody else. Whether the Niagara, the commander of the Niagara held back, or something went wrong, that's still under debate today, what went on with that. But Perry virtually went into battle alone, and he faced the British fleet, one ship to 5, for about an hour. In the course of that hour, the Lawrence was pounded into a wreck. 3 out of 5 people were killed or wounded. The guns that he could bring to bear were all dismounted and unfireable, and the ship was absolutely unmaneuverable. By that time, the rest of the fleet was fairly close. And Perry, instead of surrendering at that point, got into a small open boat, crossed across the British line of fire, and got onto the Niagara. He brought the Niagara and the rest of the fleet up. The British could see what he was going to do. He was going to try to cross their battle line. If you look over at that boat, or think of a sailing ship. It's a long, narrow vessel. The cannons are all mounted on the side. The only way that it can fire is if its broadside is presented to its enemy. What Perry wanted to do was called cross the T. He wanted to bring his broadsides to bear against the bows and sterns of the British ships, where they couldn't answer his guns. And he was able to do that. As he was coming bringing the fleet up and getting ready to cross the British T, two of the big British ships, the Detroit and the Queen Charlotte, who had been heavily damaged in their fight with the Lawrence, rammed into each other and stuck fast. At that point, Perry crossed their T, and in a few minutes, it virtually shaved Barclay with his own haggis all over in just a very short period of time. Up until that point, in the War of 1812, things had been going very bad. The Battle of Lake Erie is the first decisive American victory in the War of 1812. Perry's battle flag reflected how things were going. He fought under a banner that said, "Don't give up the ship." That's an incredibly negative connotation to that statement. That means you're in trouble. And that's what it came from. His good friend, Captain James Lawrence, those were his dying words. He lost his ship, the Chesapeake. They fought a British ship called the Shannon out on the high sea, and they were soundly beaten. As Lawrence lay dying, he said, "Fight her till she sinks, blow her up, but don't give up the ship." Several minutes after Lawrence died, the men surrendered the ship. But still, that idea that, you've got this very negative slogan. The Battle of Lake Erie gave the Americans a very positive slogan. And that's one of the things you may remember from the War of 1812. A message that Perry wrote to General William Henry Harrison, waiting over here with his army on the mainland of Ohio. On the back of an old envelope, he wrote to him, "Dear General, we have met the enemy, and they are ours." And from there on, the war in the Northwest was virtually over. With control of the Great Lakes given to the United States, Harrison's army was ferried across the lake, and in October of 1813, the British and American armies met, and the British army was defeated at the Battle of Thames. The Indian leader Tecumseh was killed there, and the Indian Confederation that he had worked so hard to forge to try to make one Indian nation fell apart at that point, and really Indian resistance in this area and the state of Ohio, as we know it now, then was able to come into being. I'd like to just illuminate a little bit about why we're here today and why you see everybody not dressed as sailors talking about a naval battle. One of Perry's big drawbacks that he had, and one of the things that I find really incredibly amazing, he did get this fleet built, as I said, and that by itself was incredible. He couldn't man it. There were no able-bodied seamen, or very few able-bodied sailors, to come out and take care of this fleet. It's a fantastic book in the gift shop. If you're in the visitor center, if you folks have a chance to look through it, it's called Amongst My Best Men. And it talks about how Perry was able to supply his fleet with the sailors and the people that he needed to fight this battle. And that's just an incredible story in and of itself. So what Perry did to arm out this fleet to get enough personnel to fight it, he asked General Harrison for any able-bodied sailors that he might have in his army, anybody who was used to using artillery or anybody that was experienced in artillery, and virtually any soldier that would volunteer. What he wanted the soldiers for basically was to take these muskets, stay up into the fighting tops, and shoot down at the enemy deck. Anti-personnel rounds, try to pick off the officers, try to pick off the people at the helm, try to disable the opposing ships. And so quite a few of them did volunteer. And that's why you see soldiers and sailors represented here today. Just a little bit about the land aspect of the War of 1812. You've all probably seen the Minutemen movies about the American Revolution, where the clever Americans used their sharp shooting rifles and hid behind trees and shot at the silly British who walked in a long straight line. That's true, it did happen. We didn't win a battle in the American Revolution until we learned to fight like the British. And the limitation of that, the reason behind all of that, was this weapon that was commonly available. This is a 69 caliber smoothbore flintlock musket. It's a muzzle loading weapon. That is, everything goes. You load everything from the front, everything comes back out of the front. A musket refers to the fact that this is a smoothbore weapon. It makes it fast to load, it makes it easy and cheap to build, which the government always loves, but it makes it incredibly inaccurate. If you could hit a stationary man-sized target with this weapon at 100 yards, you were having a really, really good day. You were incredibly lucky. The weapon is not that accurate. There were rifles. The technology of rifles was available in the United States and was well practiced. They were expensive, they were hard to load, and they were even harder to have somebody that could really use one, could reach out and put the touch on somebody at 200 or 300 yards, which the rifle of those days was capable of doing. And so the weapon dictated the tactics of the day. That's why you see the British always in the movies portrayed in those long straight lines. This gun was inaccurate. You took 100 men, lined them up, and let them all fire at the same time. You had 100 balls going downfield. You had a massive shotgun. The gun is also incredibly unreliable. This is a flintlock system. It's based on this piece of flint striking this piece of steel, creating a shower of sparks that fall into this pan. That explosion burns through a small communication hole to the main powder charge here, sets off a powder charge, throws the ball out the end of the barrel. You can probably just start ticking off in your head all the things that can go wrong with that system. The gun on the best of circumstances was about 70% reliable. And on a rainy or a humid day, black powder is hygroscopic, sucks water into itself. A rainy day, a battle would be postponed. The armies would just stop and camp, and we'll fight again on a better day. The folks that you see here in the tall hats with the white plumes represent regular United States soldiers, and they were the main body or the backbone of the army, as the infantry has always been the backbone of any army. They went in for a 2-year enlistment. They trained. At the beginning of the War of 1812, we had a very small standing army, and our soldiers weren't all that good. We'd forgotten the lessons that we'd learned in the Revolution. By the end of the War of 1812, the American Army could have stood against any army in the world at that point. We were well trained, we were well disciplined by the end of the War of 1812. And the regular infantry was part of the reason behind that. The two gentlemen to the right represent sailors that would have been part of the Deepwater people who came out to fight with Perry that were sent from Deepwater ports. They would have carried muskets up into the fighting tops once the ships were engaged and active as sharpshooters. Also, they would have been armed with boarding pikes, cutlasses, whatever, if you were going to go into a boarding action where the two ships actually touched and you sent your crew over to try to physically take them off the ship. The other gentleman that we see here is an American rifle. There, I talked about the rifles. We did have a small elite force of riflemen in the United States. The rifle takes about 3 times longer to load than the musket, but we did use them, and mostly as skirmishers. They would go out in front of the lines and try to fight each other, try to pick off officers, try to pick off artillerymen, anybody that you could take out a few key individuals and try to weaken your opponent. What we'd like to do for you now, give you a little demonstration of how the muskets are loaded and fired, give you a little bit of an idea of the drill. Attention! Shoulder! Arch! By the right flank, right, face! Forward, march! Bow to the right, march! As soldiers drilled and trained in those days, there were 2 ways that they could load and fire this musket. The first thing that they're going to do is go through loading the musket by the word of command. He's going to tell them every step that they need to take to load and fire this musket. And that's how they would drill and practice day in and day out until loading and firing this weapon became second nature. If you think about it, the term psychological warfare hadn't been coined at that point. But it was a very important concept nonetheless, and it was one that they understood. Those tall hats made you look more impressive to your enemy. And that constant drilling and how to load and fire this weapon helped you to be less nervous, because you have to remember their enemy would be closer than that seawall that they're facing over there. Again, that was a mass volley delivered at the enemy. It took care of the inaccuracy of the weapons. It also took care of the unreliability. If we have a 70% misfire rate out of that, or a 30% misfire rate out of that group, at least 70% are still going to fire, and you're going to be covered by the guys beside you who are firing. After the first shot the first volley in a battle was fired, normally the command would be given to prime and load. The soldiers would go through the same drill, but at their own speed. But once again, independent fire was not encouraged. They would deliver a mass volley.
There's a backfire or something, because they're coming out the back.
I'd like you to, if you can, use your imaginations a little bit and try to multiply that line about 100-fold. And then put an opposing force across the field. You can see the smoke and you can hear the noise. Try to amplify that in your mind, give you a little bit of an idea of what a battle in the War of 1812 would have sounded like. But not only the rattle of that musketry and the boom of the cannons and the smoke on the battlefield, I'd like you to try to throw in a couple of other sounds. That's the screams of the wounded and the dying laid on that field. The battle in the War of 1812 was clearly horrendous. Very close range. The wounds that these muskets delivered were terrible. And the medical technology of that day was such that amputation was a much easier answer than trying to extract the bullet. Out of the War of 1812, when it ended in December of 1814, the treaty that ended that war is called a status quo antebellum. And that pretty much just says that everything went back to the way it was. There was no property gained or lost between the United States and Canada. The war really didn't do anything. The problems that we had with Great Britain had already been answered. The communication was so slow we didn't realize it. As a matter of fact, one of the greatest American victories that's ever been won, the Battle of New Orleans, was fought after the War of 1812 ended because we didn't know that the peace had been signed. One of the major advantages that we did gain from the War of 1812, though, is the second half of the name of that monument, the Peace Memorial. At the end of the War of 1812, the Treaty of Ghent that stopped the war between the United States and Great Britain. We have not been at war with that country since 1812. 184 years of peace that we've had with that country. And we've developed the same peace with Canada. And if we have any Canadians here today, Canadians and the Americans can both be proud, or United States people can both be proud, that between the United States and Canada runs the longest undefended border between any two free nations in the world. And I think that's something that we can all be very, very proud of. I'd like to thank you very much for your kind attention. If you folks have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Right now to welcome the U.S. Brig Niagara to our city. Now here's the deal. Thursday and Friday there will be tours for school children. Now you need advance tickets to actually come on aboard and be able to view the vessel. Now that's for Saturday and Sunday, and then there's a concert going on Sunday right from the U.S. Brig Niagara. I'm Jayla Anderson, 13 Action News.
Jayla, thanks.
Dates back to the early 1800s and the War of 1812. Its battle days long over and has a new life as a floating museum. Phil Jones joins us with a unique